With protests and civil disobedience, power cuts and unemployment, rising gender-based violence and a litany of breakdowns in service delivery, the ANC-led government faces, by its own account, real threats to its political survival. In diagnosing why, in South Africa and in other countries, failures of governance abound, Professor and renowned author William Gumede places the blame squarely on cadre deployment and a diminished appreciation for merit. Professor Gumede, as always, thank you very much for your time and welcome. Let's begin with your observation of the ravages of cadre deployment on African countries post-liberation or independence.
Thank you for having me. I'm very grateful to be on the show. We just experienced it, on the hour we're going to have a power outage at ESCOM. And that is a direct result of cadre deployment. A couple of years ago, CEOs were appointed and executives were appointed who were ANC cadres, and often many of them did not have the skill set. And also contractors or ESCOM contracts were given to cadre or politically connected companies. And that is why we're sitting with a crisis, down the line. And unfortunately, with cadre deployments and when we have people who don't have the skills, we feel it down the line. We may not always immediately feel it, but a crisis always snowballs. And we're sitting now with that snowball of a crisis that started quite a long while ago.
And it's evidenced, as you write as well, in the Zondo report, which lays bare exactly, the end-point consequence of having people, with allegiances and access to either contracts or to associations that can be the ultimate undoing of a country.
Absolutely. If you look at even a failed state, I'll just take us out of South Africa now. Of course, our neighboring Zimbabwe. Where did it all started? It started when the governing ZANU-PF only appointed its cadres in all critical positions, gave them only government contracts and business license and so on. And then, obviously, by the late 1980s, early 90s, that country plunged into a failed state. If we can use the same example in Algeria, when the FLN, the liberation movement there, did the same when they came to power after the French left. They also appointed their own cadres in key and critical positions, and often, these movements appoint cadres not based on competency, not based on skills, but the fact that they've been in the struggle. So the struggle becomes the merit. Now, that is a wrong merit to use. And now we go to Algeria in the early 90s. Algeria fell into a civil war. Now Algeria is poorer than it was at independence.
Well, we'll talk about the Asian countries in just a moment, because there is a sermon of sobriety for us to observe in how they manage their turnaround. But I want to just quickly make another mention of the scenario in South Africa. Unless stopped now, you write, the ANC's deployment policy will be responsible for the total collapse of the state, economy and social breakdown. And that's quite a dire eventuality that you are foreseeing happening if we continue along the path that we are.
No, absolutely. We've seen it already in municipalities. 75+% of municipalities are essentially failed states at the local level. Now, very soon, if we continue with this cadre deployment at a provincial and national level and the state-owned entity level, we will see more states collapse. And normally, the thing is with state collapse and institutional collapse, it starts slowly, and often we don't see it, and then it snowballs, and then we see the impact of it. Right now, for example, I'll just give you an example of our infrastructure facilities across the country. We now have the total collapse of infrastructure, but it happened many years ago with the appointment of often incompetent cadres and giving the contracts to politically connected companies that often never had the skills and and so on. And now we have almost where the whole infrastructure system of South Africa is collapsing, and now it is much more expensive to maintain what we have. In fact, it would be more cheaper to build new infrastructure than maintain the current infrastructure. So that is a real impact, real life impact on the country.
I mean, I'm just reflecting on, numerous press conferences where we talk about, an incapable state, or we're getting answers from ministers and so on. And kind of, we're often presented with this frame that, the minister or the person at the top of a particular portfolio is always going to be a ceremonial head. It is the DGs and, the technocrats who really make the decisions and create the functionality of the office. And that there's nothing, nothing wrong with that. It seems then, based on what you're writing, that we're drinking the wrong Kool-Aid on this.
Absolutely. I mean, everything wrong with this. Firstly, the ANC has become, like other liberation movements in Africa, becomes a party state where the party and the state becomes the same thing. So when you have cadre deployment, that is what happens. So only the party members get appointed. They're not only the ministerial level, because that's normally in a society, in any kind of democracy, you appoint political appointees at the cabinet level. But what we've seen, we also have political appointees at the director general level and all the way down at the senior level, and increasingly even, as you enter at the entry level, we've seen cadres and so on. So, the whole system from top to bottom, and then also, the contracts, the state is a really big contractor. Normally, for example, out of, say, a 1.5 trillion budget every year of our country, the state would have, contracts worth between 600 and 700 billion rand. So if you think about all of those contracts, a lot of those contracts then goes to cadres. Really is it undermines the capability of the state. So when we talk about state capacity, there is the problem.
I can't leave you without the quick, comparison between us and our Asian counterparts as cases in point. You write about a lot of them being, in a worse state around the time that certain countries in Africa obtained their independence. Basically the reason or the recipe for their transformation was ensuring that there were merit-based appointments. Was that the single recipe?
It all starts with merit-based appointment. I'll just give you an example of South Korea and Ghana. Now, in the late 1950s, South Korea was poorer than Ghana. Now, by the late 1980s, South Korea, was in the top 20 biggest economies in the world, and Ghana was poorer than it was in the late 1950s. Now, what was the big difference there? The big difference was, although they all started from, poor, South Korea implemented in the public service, in particularly merit-based. It tried to get the best people, the most talented people in the country at all times to get into the state. And it didn't matter whether, those talented people supported the governing party, whether they was from the same ethnic group and so on. All that mattered is that they had the skills and so on. So what stands between a country that moves out of poverty into wealthy status really is how a country uses its human capital, all the human capital, and place them in the right places. The countries that cannot do that use cadre deployment, those are the countries that stay in poverty.
Certainly worth a read, because you also talk about, whether the ANC is paying attention to these signs. Thank you so much for your analysis and sharing it with us. Political analyst, author of A Restless Nation, Making Sense of Troubled Times, Professor William Gumede.